The Orion's Edge drifted through the emptiness of space, its titanium hull bearing the deep scars of interstellar travel. The ship's engines let out a low, rhythmic hum, a familiar sound that had always been a source of comfort to the crew, but now seemed to mock the tense silence in the command center. The forgotten planet, known in archaic star maps as Velta 7, loomed ahead, a sphere of bruised crimson wreathed in a haze of ochre dust. For years, its existence had been whispered about, a ghostly echo of failed expeditions and sudden, inexplicable disappearances. Captain Elias Ward stood at the front of the viewing deck, his rugged face illuminated by the dim glow of the planet's reflected light. Every line etched into his features told a story of battles fought and victories claimed. But today there was no triumph in his expression. He turned to Dr. Marlowe Sinclair, the ship's xenolinguist and resident archaeologist, who was busy scrutinizing a series of fragmented, pre-expedition data files. Anything useful? Ward's voice, though calm, carried a timbre that resonated with the unspoken dread that had settled over them since the mission's announcement. Marlowe glanced up, eyes as sharp as ever behind her wire-rimmed glasses. Only fragments of old reports, mentions of strange magnetic fields, brief transmissions that cut out mid-sentence, that kind of thing. Nothing concrete. Her hands trembled slightly as she tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. Sergeant Marcos Ramos, a towering figure with eyes as cold and steady as steel, shifted his weight and cleared his throat. Whatever's down there, we handle it like any hostile environment. Secure the area, find what we came for, and get out. Engineer Harrow, lean with a mop of unruly hair and a nervous disposition, muttered from behind his console, "Assuming we make it out." His attempt at a joke fell flat, lost in the stifling atmosphere of the room. A klaxon rang, signaling their descent, as the automated voice of the ship's AI droned, "Initiating landing sequence. All crew, prepare for atmospheric breach." The ship shuddered as it descended, pushed and pulled by an unseen force that sent tremors through the deck and rattled their teeth. The planet's atmosphere fought them like a living thing, swirling with currents that defied known physics. Sparks flew from the panels as Harrow yelled out, "Stabilizers are maxed. We're getting serious interference." Ward gripped the armrest of his chair, eyes fixed on the readout that flashed warnings in a crimson hue. Outside, the landscape came into view, a vast expanse of cracked terrain that stretched endlessly, interrupted only by jagged pillars of rock that clawed at the blood-red sky. With a jolt that sent everyone lurching forward, the Orion's Edge landed, skidding on the brittle surface before grinding to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the hissing of the ship's systems recalibrating to the new environment. Ward stood, muscles stiff from tension. "Check the external sensors," he ordered. The screens blinked as data scrolled across them, readings of the atmosphere, the composition of the ground, and the faint, irregular pulses that indicated some kind of electromagnetic activity. Ramos and Marlowe exchanged a glance before pulling on their helmets, each click of their suits locking into place, echoing like a heartbeat. One by one, they disembarked, stepping into the alien landscape. The ground crunched beneath their boots, releasing puffs of rust-colored dust that hung in the air like a shroud. The sky above was an unsettling tapestry of swirling clouds, shifting between dark purples and deep reds, giving the sensation of being watched. Harrow stumbled over a twisted piece of metal half buried in the ground. It was old, its surface eaten away by years of exposure, but unmistakably crafted. "This must be from one of the lost expeditions," Marlowe whispered, voice crackling over the comms. "Then we aren't the first ones to find this place," Ramos said, his grip on his pulse rifle tightening. The realization that others had stood where they now stood and never left settled like a lead weight in their chests. The distant horizon, broken by skeletal spires that reached into the cloud-choked sky, drew their attention. Something about those formations felt wrong. Their symmetry was too perfect, too deliberate, as though constructed with a purpose long forgotten. The team pressed on, each step guided by a mix of awe and a gnawing sense of encroaching dread. They approached the largest structure, a broken shell of what might have been a fortress or a temple. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, their edges glowing faintly as though alive with a pulse only the ancient could remember. The wind shifted, carrying with it a metallic scent, sharp and suffocating. Harrow gagged, pulling back instinctively. Ward's voice, barely above a whisper, came through the comms. "Stay sharp. We're not alone." As the last of the sun's light waned, the darkness of Velta, 7 enveloped them, thick and suffocating. The ruins ahead seemed to quiver in the half-light, and somewhere in the distance, a sound like shattering glass pierced the silence. It was an unnatural sound, one that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. Marlowe glanced over her shoulder at Ward, her eyes wide with the realization of what their mission truly entailed. This was no search for relics, nor a routine mineral survey. They were intruders on a planet that remembered, and whatever awaited them in the shadows knew they were here. The air hummed with an ancient electric anticipation, as if the planet itself was taking a breath. The ruins loomed like skeletal remains against the rust-stained sky, their jagged contours casting long, broken shadows that slithered over the cracked earth. The team moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the fine iron-red dust that had settled like a funeral shroud over everything. Captain Ward led the way, his pulse rifle held tightly, every muscle in his body coiled with the tension of the unknown. Marlowe Sinclair followed closely, her eyes wide and bright with both fear and the insatiable curiosity that had defined her career. Sergeant Ramos maintained a vigilant rear guard, eyes flicking between the group and the shifting horizon. Harrow, the engineer, stayed in the center, casting nervous glances at the towering monoliths that surrounded them. Each pillar was engraved with strange fluid symbols, winding around their surfaces like a story left half told. The designs seemed to shimmer as if alive, reflecting a light source that didn't exist. "Captain, over here," Marlowe called, her voice strained as she knelt by a large slab that had fallen from one of the structures. The glyphs on its surface were more intricate, lined with a dark tar-like substance that caught the faint, crimson glow of the waning daylight. Ward approached and knelt beside her, the hum of the ruin vibrating through his knees. "What do you make of it?" Marlowe's fingers traced the carvings with a careful reverence. "These aren't just decorative. This is language, symbols of warning, or maybe a record." She looked up at Ward, her pupils wide with a dawning horror. "These are chronicles." Before Ward could respond, a low groan resonated through the ground beneath them, as if the planet itself had exhaled. Dust cascaded from above, and a hairline crack snaked across the stone floor, stopping inches from Harrow's boot. He jumped back with a yelp, eyes darting around for reassurance that it was just an aftershock. But nothing about this place felt natural. Ramos stepped forward, scanning the symbols with a hardened gaze. "What does it say, Sinclair? Can you read it?" Marlowe shook her head, the weight of realization settling in her chest. "It's not entirely decipherable, but from what I can piece together, it tells of a great calamity, a force they called the Devourer." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Not a deity or a creature, but something that fed on them in ways we can't understand." Harrow's laugh was sharp, bordering on hysterical. "Great. A force that eats civilizations, just what we needed." "Keep it together," Ward snapped, though he couldn't blame Harrow for the tremor in his voice. Even he felt the suffocating grip of fear twisting in his gut. Marlowe continued, her eyes locked on the final set of symbols that curved around the edge of the stone. The figures depicted an eerie sequence, beings similar to the humanoid inhabitants they'd envisioned, with hollow eyes that reflected terror, reaching toward a central darkness, a void so carefully carved it seemed to absorb the dim light around it. "There's more," she said, her voice barely audible. "This civilization was advanced, far more than we anticipated. They tried to fight it, to harness it, but..." The sound came again, this time louder, as if it came from within the stone walls themselves, a scraping metallic echo that resonated with an intelligence older than their species. Ward rose to his feet, raising a clenched fist to signal silence. The air felt thick, charged with a static that prickled the exposed skin of their faces and hands. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the gaping windows of the ruined structure, carrying with it the scent of rust and decay. Suddenly, the shadows cast by their lanterns shifted. The dark shapes moved not as their bodies did, but independently, twisting and recoiling from the light as if in pain. Ramos cursed under his breath, leveling his rifle at the inky tendrils that slithered back into the crevices. "Stay close," Ward commanded, his voice a tight thread against the noise of the wind and the heartbeat thundering in his ears. A shuddering boom echoed through the ruin, and the ground beneath them trembled as though the world had been struck by a giant's fist. Marlowe stumbled, catching herself on a pillar that thrummed under her touch. As she steadied, she noticed something she hadn't before, a set of faint, claw-like marks gouged deep into the stone, leading downward into the yawning darkness of a collapsed corridor. "There's something down there," she said, stepping back as dread coiled around her throat. Harrow's voice broke, splintered by a terror he couldn't hide. "We need to leave. Now. Whatever did that, it's not dead." Ward nodded, but hesitation flickered across his face as he glanced at Marlowe. The obsession in her eyes had returned, that insatiable drive to discover that had propelled her through countless star systems and cost her so much. Before he could speak, the ground cracked again, wider this time, splitting apart to reveal a cavern below, its depths illuminated by a pulsing, dark glow that seemed to breathe. The air grew colder, each exhale condensing in front of their visors. From within the cavern came a guttural, rumbling sound that resonated through their bones. A pair of eyes, glistening like polished obsidian and as deep as a bottomless pit, blinked open, locking onto the intruders with a sentient rage. "Run," Ward whispered, though the command had barely passed his lips before the creature surged forward, its sinewy form emerging from the abyss with an unnatural grace. It was not a beast, but a living nightmare made of shadows and talons, shifting and reforming as it lashed out. Screams shattered the silence as they sprinted back through the maze of ruins, their lights casting wild, frantic beams. The symbols around them glowed brighter, pulsing in time with the creature's advance, as if awakening to an ancient, forgotten call. The echoes of the lost civilization roared in their ears, a chorus of warnings too late to heed. The wind outside had turned from a distant whisper to a roaring gale that rattled the ruins like a dying beast. The crew huddled together inside the remnants of what might have once been a grand chamber, its fractured ceiling open to the storm-swept sky. Captain Ward's eyes darted to each shadow that danced against the jagged stone walls, their movements too fluid, too alive. Marlowe stood closest to the center, her gaze locked on the obsidian sphere they had retrieved. It sat on a makeshift pedestal of cracked stone, vibrating with an energy that set their teeth on edge. The sphere's surface shifted, tiny motes of light flickering like trapped stardust, and the strange hum that had haunted them since their landing seemed to deepen, echoing in the space between their heartbeats. Harrow's fingers fumbled with a handheld scanner, the green light stuttering across his face as his hand shook. "This isn't right," he said, eyes wide with panic. "There's no power source nearby. Nothing should be causing this." "Quiet," Ramos barked, the barrel of his rifle following the length of a shadow that stretched impossibly across the room, slithering like an eel through water. It receded as the light fell on it, folding into the cracks of the wall with a sentience that defied logic. Ward adjusted his grip on his weapon, the metal cold and comforting in his hand. "Stay focused. We've faced worse than this." But Marlowe's voice, soft and hollow, cut through the tension. "No, we haven't," she said, eyes transfixed on the sphere as a sliver of movement shifted within it. "We're in the middle of a warning. This isn't just history. It's happening now." Before anyone could respond, the lights around them flickered, once, twice, before plunging them into a darkness so thick it felt suffocating. Their suits' emergency lamps activated, casting narrow cones of illumination that barely penetrated the gloom. The shifting shadows coalesced, now more distinct and more malicious, dancing along the walls with a grotesque elegance. The first scream came from behind. Harrow. The light from his suit spun wildly, illuminating his face twisted in terror as a long, sinuous shape rose from the floor behind him. It wrapped around his waist in an instant, pulling him backward with a force that sent his tools clattering to the ground. The sound was swallowed by the sudden, oppressive silence that followed. "Get back!" Ramos shouted, firing a round into the darkness. The bursts of blue light revealed glimpses of a creature that seemed to ripple in and out of existence, its form a mass of writhing tendrils and void black eyes that reflected their panic. Harrow's scream cut off as quickly as it began, leaving only the echo reverberating in their helmets. Marlowe staggered back, her eyes darting between the sphere and the darkness that surged around them. "It's reacting to the sphere," she whispered, voice trembling. "We have to—" But she never finished. A sharp crack splintered the air as the ceiling above them buckled, stones falling in a cascade that sent them scrambling. Ward dove forward, grabbing Marlowe by the arm and pulling her out of the path of a massive slab that crashed down where she had been standing. The room was now an inferno of chaos. Shadows leapt and twisted, no longer confined to the walls, but crawling over the floor, probing with limbs that flickered between solidity and smoke. The sphere on the pedestal pulsed faster, emitting a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in their chests. Ramos roared as one of the shadows latched onto his leg, its texture slick and cold even through the suit. He swung the butt of his rifle into the dark mass, but it passed through like mist before solidifying again, climbing higher as if tasting his flesh with unseen mouths. Ward lunged, firing into the shadow until it recoiled with a hiss, disintegrating into a fine black mist. Ramos gasped, his eyes meeting Ward's with gratitude before they both turned toward Marlowe, who had reached for the sphere, her hands hovering above it as if in a trance. "Marlowe, what are you doing?" Ward shouted, but the moment she touched the sphere, the world seemed to freeze. A low, resonant sound rippled outward, silencing the wind and the roar of chaos. The shadows froze, their forms locked mid-motion as the pulsing light within the sphere brightened. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then the sphere shattered. The noise was deafening, a shriek of metal and stone that reverberated through their bones. A wave of black energy rolled out from the fragments, sending them all sprawling. When Ward struggled to his feet, his vision swam with the afterimage of the explosion, bright lines of light searing his retinas. The darkness that had clung to the walls and floor coalesced into a single entity, a towering, inky form that stretched to the broken ceiling. It pulsed with an alien intelligence, eyes of molten gold opening across its surface and staring down at them with something akin to amusement. Harrow's absence felt like a void in their ranks, and the realization that whatever had him was now looking at them with the same hunger sent a chill through the remaining crew. The creature shifted, its tendrils winding around the crumbling pillars as it whispered in a language they couldn't comprehend, but felt in their bones. Ramos stepped forward, jaw clenched as he raised his rifle one last time. "Go," he ordered, his voice steady. The others hesitated, the command cutting through their paralysis like a blade. "Ramos, no," Marlowe began, but he was already moving, a streak of light and defiance as he charged into the shadow. The sound of gunfire and the creature's guttural response filled the air as Ward pulled Marlowe back, dragging her toward the only remaining exit. As they stumbled into the corridor beyond, the last thing Ward saw before the ruin collapsed behind them was Ramos, standing defiant as the shadows enveloped him, his light swallowed whole. The ruins quaked behind them as Captain Ward and Dr. Marlowe Sinclair stumbled into the labyrinthine corridors, their breath ragged and labored. The air was thick, as if each molecule was soaked in fear. Dust filled their lungs, and the muffled booms of the collapsing temple echoed like the pounding of a drum, an anthem of their impending doom. Ramos was gone, his final stand seared into Ward's mind, a sacrifice burned with valor and futility. "Keep moving." Ward's voice was hoarse, forced past the lump that had formed in his throat. He glanced back at Marlowe, who stumbled over a cracked stone, the weight of what she carried evident in her every faltering step. The fractured remnants of the obsidian sphere were clutched in her gloved hands, their jagged edges glinting with a dark, inner light that refused to fade. I can't feel my legs," Marlowe gasped, falling to her knees as the corridor opened into a vast chamber that stretched out like a cavernous maw. Statues of the ancient civilization stood sentinel, their faces carved in expressions of horror that mirrored her own. Ward knelt beside her, gripping her arm. "You have to get up, Marlowe," he said. But his voice trembled, and they both knew that hope had long abandoned them. A deep, rhythmic noise like the beating of a colossal heart resonated through the chamber. The creature was close, and the darkness around them began to ripple as if alive, inching forward with the slow certainty of death. Marlowe lifted her head, her face streaked with sweat and dust. Her eyes, once so full of curiosity and determination, now gleamed with the acceptance of an unavoidable truth. "Ward," she whispered, pressing the fractured sphere into his chest. "It was never meant to be controlled. This was their last attempt to stop it, and it failed." Ward stared at her, the implications unraveling in his mind like a poison. The ancient civilization had not been overcome by an invading force or a malevolent god. It had unleashed something it couldn't contain, something woven into the very fabric of the planet. The shadows weren't just entities, they were the living embodiment of the planet's defense, a reaction that turned against its own makers when their ambition outgrew their caution. "Marlowe, we can't just give up," Ward said, though his voice cracked, betraying the fear he'd tried to bury. "There has to be a way." But even as he spoke, the darkness thickened, coiling around their feet and slithering up the pillars. The statue's eyes seemed to glow with a cold, blue light, their silent vigil now a mocking testament to their fate. The creature emerged from the depths of shadow, its form amorphous and shifting, tendrils tipped with glistening eyes and gaping mouths that whispered in a language only the dead could understand. Marlowe looked at Ward one last time, her expression softening with something that felt like regret but also resolve. "Go," she said, her voice stronger now, like a flame rekindled. "You need to survive this. Tell them what happened here. Tell them not to make the same mistakes." "No," Ward protested, but Marlowe's hand moved with sudden strength, shoving him backward. He fell to the ground just as the creature lunged, its dark tendrils enveloping her in an embrace that was neither swift nor merciful. Her scream pierced the air, mingled with the sound of shattering bones and tearing flesh, before being swallowed whole by the silence that followed. Ward's vision swam with tears, blurring the sight of her final moments. But there was no time to grieve. The creature's eyes shifted to him, blinking in unison like a grotesque constellation. He staggered to his feet, clutching the fractured sphere as if it were the only anchor in a sea of chaos. He ran, each step pulling him deeper into the maze of ruins, the monster's guttural growl reverberating behind him. His mind raced, trying to piece together Marlowe's words. It was never meant to be controlled. The obsidian sphere was not a weapon nor a shield. It was a key, a relic forged in desperation by a race that had been willing to sacrifice everything to contain their own hubris. A keystone to an ancient mechanism. Ward's light caught on a mural, half hidden beneath layers of dust and shadow, depicting a circle of figures surrounding a larger broken sphere. The realization hit him like a blow. It wasn't just the artifact he held, it was the planet itself. Velta 7 was a prison, designed to contain the thing that now hunted him. A roar echoed from behind, the sound of nightmares made real. The chamber's walls cracked and a fissure split the floor beneath him. Ward dropped to his knees, cradling the broken sphere in his hands, feeling its hum resonate with the tremors beneath his feet. If he couldn't wield it, he could at least complete what the ancients had failed to do. He pressed the shards into the ground, aligning them with the carvings beneath his fingers, their sharp edges biting into his flesh. The air grew colder, charged with an energy so ancient it felt sacred. The creature surged forward, eyes burning with rage, its form stretching out to consume him. Ward's breath came in short, gasping sobs, but he forced himself to speak. "If you wanted us gone, you should have left us forgotten," he whispered, activating the mechanism with the last ounce of his strength. A blinding light erupted from the sphere's pieces, enveloping the chamber in a surge of radiant energy. The creature reared back, its tendrils thrashing and recoiling as if touched by flame. The ground shook violently, and the air filled with a deafening, otherworldly howl. The light intensified until it was all-consuming, a white void that drowned out everything. Ward's world turned to darkness. When the last echoes of the quake faded, Velta 7 lay still once more. The sky, once roiling with storms, had cleared to reveal a tapestry of stars. But the ruins remained silent, a graveyard of ambition and secrets, with no living soul left to tell the tale. In the heart of the shattered temple, the pieces of the obsidian sphere glimmered softly before dimming, the last remnants of its power sinking into the planet it had once imprisoned. And above, unnoticed by any, the stars continued their silent vigil, indifferent to the fate of those who dared to challenge the unknown.